So yes, I'm Jada Hudson. I am a counselor that specializes with first responders. I've done a lot of trainings, I've done a lot of ride-alongs, and I've sought out a lot of expert, advice from experts in the field on pediatric death, substance abuse, and PTSD. So I started working with first responders back in the late 90s. I worked for Department of Corrections, and I counseled correctional officers all over the state of Illinois in the prison system. But I also have lived experience. So I take all of that I've studied in school through theory and all of the trainings and the immersion I've had in the first responder world, but I grew up in a first responder household. So this isn't simply just a job to me. I'm very passionate about what I do, and I have a lot of lived experience through my family. My family comprises of, my dad was a correctional officer. He was a sniper for Stateville, and he worked in the towers, and he worked in the cell houses for over 20 years. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good, because I hate that mic, so I'll talk louder, just let me know. My brother there in the middle, he was an Aurora firefighter. And then my other brother there, he took his own life when I was 12 years old. And so obviously, all of them had an impact on me. I also have cousins who were police officers. My uncle was a New York City police officer, other firefighters in the family. So when I tell you that this is personal, it is. And I have a lot, they all had their struggles. I'm not going to get into that today, but when I work with clients in my office, I take what I've learned through theory and what I've learned in real life, and I try to help the first responder population, and it's very important to me. So I've been asked many times to segment out some of these points. For example, to just do a suicide prevention training or just do addiction. So I was asked originally here to do just an addiction training, but it's impossible for me to do that because they all go together, okay? Depression affects substance abuse, which affects PTSD, which also in turn affects suicide. They all fit together, they all affect one another. So that's why this presentation is going to be about all of these things. It's going to be about what I call first responder depression, suicide, addiction, and trauma and PTSD. So please, if you guys have any questions at all, stop, or if you have comments, or if you just want to talk and get off topic, I really don't care if we get through all these slides. It makes no difference to me. If you want to have a conversation instead, that's fine by me. So feel free to raise your hand or ask any questions. So normally, when we think of depression, we think of female depression. We think the signs and symptoms that are in what I use to make a diagnosis is based on what's called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is a book that I look up codes and diagnosis. And those signs and symptoms are based on female signs and symptoms of depression. First responders have a different kind of depression. It's covert. It is a secret depression. And it is very troublesome for this population because it can be missed. It's a secret. First responders try very hard to hide their depression, which in turn can cause lots and lots of problems. So when we think of an overt depression, that's what we normally think of with depression. We think of somebody who's completely shut down, who can't function anymore, who cries, who can't get out of bed, who can't go to work, right? So that's sort of when we think of like alcoholism and we think of the functional alcoholic, it's like the functional depressant. So people will miss it because I'll show you later that people who have this kind of depression, most people think they're rock stars. Most people think they're functioning very, very well. But inside, they could be falling apart. So normally, the normal, everyday, definition of depression is persistent feelings of sadness and worthlessness, a lack of desire to engage in formally pleasurable activities. This is not what first responders exhibit. This is not it. So they have, again, this covert depression. And when we think of this kind of depression, we have to go back to how males were raised. Now, yes, I know females are in the fire service and police officers. However, I find that the type of female that goes towards this profession, myself included, we're raised to shut off feelings, we're raised to just push through, very goal-oriented, get the job done and kind of disconnect from emotion. And that's the kind of female that will gravitate towards this. So I have renamed it as more of first responder depression. But it really, this comes from male psychology. So males were taught at a very young age. If you think about it, you think about football practice and a little boy will say, he's hurt, he's crying, and what do people tell him? You're not hurt, get back out there, rub some dirt in it, quit your crying, right? So at a very young age, we're teaching men, the message is shut down from your emotion. Don't have feelings, feelings are shameful, and get back out there, push through, get the job done. So this sets off, and this has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, okay? The problem is that when people don't feel free to express their emotions, they'll do other things to cope with their emotions, which can be very devastating. So this originates to basically how we raise men, or some ladies are raised. I know I was too. I came from a first responder family. My dad was not any easier on me. It was like, just get the job done, quit being emotional, and, do what you gotta do. That's why I drove here in below zero weather, almost 2 hours, because I had to do the job, get the job done. So again, they're taught to pull together, get it together, and push through. So this teaches men to shove aside the emotions, not feel anything, and to feel actual shame for any anxiety they have, any fear they have, any sadness they have. They feel shame usually. So the way the author states it is it's hidden from a person's own conscious awareness, yet drives many of his or her actions. So what that means is you're not really aware that you're doing this, but it's the constant driver behind everything that you do. So how do people with this secret depression cope? So the overt depression, the depression that we always think of, people cry, they are incapacitated, they can't function. This is how first responders medicate when they're depressed. They work a lot. They achieve a lot. Why? How would that be? What would that serve? Why would that be a medication for depression?
Distracting. Distracting.
Distracting, but there's also, if any of you are familiar with the Pavlov dog, any of you know what? Okay, so every time you have a goal, you hit a goal, all of these sort of endorphins go off. Just think of gambling. Whenever you win, ding, 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 you feel great. You have euphoria, you have dopamine, you have serotonin, you have adrenaline, you have all these chemicals going off and you're feeling great. Well, it's the same thing. Every time you get a new certificate, every time you get a goal, and every time you hit, some sort of work-related goal, you get high off of your own achievement. That's a way to medicate yourself when you might be depressed. Excessive exercise. Now, I'm a big fan of exercise. That will keep you resilient in this career. However, when it's used to excess, it could be an indication that you are medicating from a depression. Excessive focus on sports performance, anger. Now, how could that be medicating from a depression? When you think about the biology that I'm talking about, think about that for a minute. When you're in the fight or flight response, right, a tiger's going to eat you, right? Or a tiger's going to eat another tiger, let's use that example. That tiger roars and gets really, really angry, and all of those endorphins that help you when you're in the fight for your life, again, it's dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, cortisol, right? So when you are angry, it's kind of like you're in this fight or flight response, and you get all of these drugs that actually make you feel better in the long run, even though you're destroying your family relationships, you're destroying your marriages, your relationships with your kids. But this anger produces a chemical response, and and then you kind of come down from it, and you're like, wow, you know, subconsciously, you're gonna feel better. And so if you've ever heard of addicted to the chaos kind of thing, or someone who's always kind of stirring the pot and always, so whenever things are calm, maybe that person's depressed, and they sort of like pick a fight. So they can get angry, so they can get all of the chemical response, and then they feel better. Of course, this isn't something somebody does on purpose. It's a subconscious kind of thing. Does that make sense? These ladies here know what I'm talking about. I like it. Alcohol, drug abuse. Okay, so same thing. When you're feeling bad, this has been taught to first responders since the beginning of time. If you have something bad, you know, bad call, let's go talk about it in the bar, right? Let's get a shot. Take the edge off. It's been taught in the fire service, police officers, correctional officers. When something bad happens and when you're not feeling good, you have been taught to drink alcohol for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. You've been taught to do this. And it works. And it works very well for a very long time until it doesn't work anymore. So what happens is over time, when you use alcohol to feel better, your body stops making its own feel-good drugs, and then you become sort of dependent upon that alcohol. So if every night you're taking a couple shots, you're drinking a couple shots, your body stops making its own antidepressants, its own natural antidepressants. And when you drink, you're getting a tiny bump of serotonin that makes you feel better, and that's what everybody chases. They chase that little bitty buzz, right? They're chasing that. But what happens in the long run, after about an hour, your serotonin levels drop to way down here. And so you're feeling worse than if you would have never drank it all. But over time, it's going to take you more and more and more alcohol just to reach this little buzz, and then the lows are going to be much lower. And then your body stops making its own chemicals that are there and designed to make you feel better, like dopamine, serotonin, and adrenaline, and cortisol, I mean not cortisol, but adrenaline. Those are the chemicals that make you feel better naturally. And you kind of messed up your chemicals when you start drinking a lot. So affairs. Affairs, this author states, are the dirty little secret because the emotional part of when somebody has an affair is that they talk to that other person and they share emotions and feelings. So it's really not the sex that's the big dirty secret, it's the fact that that person has emotion. And so many times first responders want to go home and they want to show their wives that they have it all together, that they can handle all the problems, that nothing gets, that they don't want their wives to think that they can't handle something, or that they're emotional, or they're worried, or they're scared. And so the big secret is that they have emotions, not necessarily the sex. Remember, growing up this way, emotions are shameful. Having anxiety, feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I can support this family. I'm worried about our finances. I'm worried about all of my injuries. I'm worried, worried, worried. They don't want to tell their spouses that. They want their spouses to think, I have it all together. You know, I'm a hero. So they go and they have these affairs and they don't necessarily tell their wives about the emotions. So addiction to pornography, that's another big one. If you think about everything I'm talking about, the chemical, physiological component to this, pornography, what does that do? Dopamine, serotonin, all of the chemicals, you can be addicted, and that is a big problem. I caution everyone. A lot of times these days, people are looking for adult pornography, and there have been instances where they had child pornography downloaded and they didn't want it, they didn't search it out, and it has ruined careers, ruined lives, ruined lives. So be careful. That's all I'm going to say. And then again, there's the risk-taking behaviors, just in general, like riding a motorcycle too fast or taking chances. Those risk-taking activities, again, what does that do? You get those chemicals and you feel better. So all these are an indicator. So how do you know if you have this like secret covert depression? Well, when you're still and you're not doing all of this stuff, how do you feel? Do you get sad? Are you starting to think about calls? Are you just thinking about your personal life? Are you starting to shut down so then you distract yourself with all these things and you keep super busy so you don't have to think about these things? Well, that's an indicator. And this stuff catches up to you. Most of my first responder clients are actually in their late 30s, early 40s. That's the time where they just really can't take it anymore. That's the time where it builds up. Lots of calls, lots of things they've seen, you know, marriage problems, children, financial problems. So that's when I usually see my clients. But I have had instances, for example, when you keep running away from this kind of depression. I had a retired guy from Southern Illinois, and they don't have a whole lot of counselors in Southern Illinois, so he called me because he didn't know what was happening to him. He was a rock star firefighter apparently, but when he quit working and he was still, he started getting a lot of nightmares and intrusive thoughts about calls he had from 20 years ago. Calls that he never really dealt with, and that when that stillness happens, all of these things you're avoiding, they come back to you. And so it was awful. He was being tortured by a lot of calls that he had seen over the years, that and a lot of issues in his life in general that he hadn't dealt with. So how does this compulsive, I call it compulsive overactivity, how does this mask a depression? It keeps you so busy you never have time to feel what you're feeling. You don't have time. You're just constantly distracting yourself. So any sadness, any worry, any anxiety that you have, you're not going to feel that because you're going to keep yourself busy. So keeping busy can block out painful emotions, sadness, depression. People around you, and this is a problem, they're not going to spot this depression because it looks like you're doing and functioning very well. Because what do we say in this society? If you want something done, give it to a busy person. We glorify busy people in this country. I mean, Europe and stuff, they have a whole other work ethic there in Europe. We glorify this, get the job done, have millions of things, and working ourselves, you know, not just one job, but you have 2, 3 jobs. So we glorify this type. So people around you, family, friends, coworkers, they might not recognize this kind of depression because it looks like you're functioning well. Again, society values this. Society values this productivity. But the most important thing is I haven't seen any really hardcore research on this, but it's my feeling with my experience that when people have really good family relationships and they're really connected to their spouse and they're really connected to their families, I personally see a reduction in substance abuse and a reduction in PTSD. Now, I don't have any cold hard facts for this, but when you keep yourself so busy that you don't have time to connect with your spouse and time to connect with your children and your family, you're not keeping yourself resilient as you can in order to endure this career or just life in general. Because the research shows that connection to family is a resiliency, and it is protective. It's protective against trauma and all kinds, suicide and all kinds of things. And how are you going to have a good connection with your family if you keep yourself so busy you don't have time to spend with them? You can't have a good relationship if you're not spending time. I do couples therapy for first responders, and it's really funny because the only time they see each other is in their session with me in couples counseling. They haven't talked to each other sometimes unless they get to couples counseling. They get to couples counseling, they start catching up on like all of their agenda. Oh, didn't you know this? Didn't you know this? They don't talk to each other. And so when you don't spend time together and you keep yourself so busy, it can be a problem. And it can take away one of your best coping skills. So, again, all of these go hand in hand. This depression, this secret depression, it can affect suicide rates. My favorite theorist for suicide is Dr. Thomas Joyner. I saw him, I don't know, gosh, it's been like 7 years ago. I went to one of his conferences, and just like you guys, you know, I have to go to conferences like this and seminars, and I'm like, oh my gosh, another suicide one. Because I've been to so many in my career. I've been a counselor for over 25 years, and I've seen a lot of suicide conferences. And obviously, since my own brother took his life, it's an important topic for me, but it got to be like the same old thing, the signs and symptoms, but it never really got to the why people do this. And Dr. Thomas Joyner really gets to that. He has a very interesting story himself. His father took his own life when he was in college, and he was at the university, either Florida State or University of Florida, the one in Tallahassee. And so right when he was in college, his dad took his own life. His father had been at the same job for over 30 years, and he got laid off. And he felt like a lot of people at work turned their backs on him. People he thought that were friends. He lost his identity. And so there was a lot of behavioral and emotional things that went on, but it really caught Thomas Joyner's family completely off guard. And so he decided to spend the rest of his career developing a theory of suicide that made sense to him. And so I really like what he has to say, and I got really excited when I was at that conference because it was completely different than all the conferences I had been to before. So his theory, there are 3 components that are essential for someone to take their own life. And one must have all 3. Unfortunately, all of you first responders have one, and so you only have 2 to work with. One is a risk-taking personality. So would you agree that firefighters have risk-taking personalities, right? Because if you're going to run into a burning building or run into trouble when everyone else is running away from it, you're pretty much a risk taker. And so there is a personality test called the Myers-Briggs personality test, and that indicates that first responders are what's called the ISTP, which I'm not really going to get into, but the hallmarks of this personality type are being very self-sufficient, excelling in high-pressure emergency situations, closet daredevils, and enjoying fast-moving or risky behaviors, or hobbies. So does that sound like first responder to you? So the bad news is 1 is already down, so you only have 2 to work with. So the other 2 are the perception of being a burden and a low sense of belonging. So what does that look like in real life? So it could play out, and I'll give you some different scenarios of how this plays out. His theory actually changed the way I do my suicide assessments now. So let's look at burden. Someone could feel like a burden if they have a lot of injuries and they have chronic pain and they can't do the stuff they normally could do. They have like shoulder problems, so they can't like do household chores, and they can't do, so they feel like they're letting their families down. They could feel like a burden if they've made mistakes on the job and they feel a burden to their department. They could feel like they're a burden if they have financial problems and they're going through a bankruptcy. So there's lots of ways that can play out, you know. So I always kind of look at what is going on in that person's life, and this is how all of you can help each other too. Pay attention, get to know each other and what's going on in your lives, and that way you can recognize when something's wrong, and you have that open communication, and you have, you know, that connection. And so when someone's going through that divorce, right, or when someone's going through bankruptcy or pain, you know, then you can recognize that. Low sense of belonging, that could be, you know, that guy that no one likes, right? So they don't belong here, you know, everyone, you know, no one really likes them, people kind of shun him. They go home, they're on the verge of a divorce, and their family doesn't really like them, and their family says, boy, I wish you were at work, because we like you better when you're at work. So that feeling, so it also, people who are newly retired, you really have to look out for them. That person, the retired firefighter, there is a higher rate of suicide for the retired firefighter. There's research out there, I think, that a lot of firefighters commit suicide like shortly after retirement. So you really have to keep an eye on, because think about it, they've lost their identity. The identity is huge for the first responder population. More than other occupations, you really look at that as kind of who you are. So when you retire, you've lost that sense of belonging. And the divorce rate is up for 55 and older. The divorce rate's actually down for every demographic except the retired, the older couple. That divorce rate is up higher. So you look at that. So maybe they are going through a divorce. And what happens when you go through a divorce? Then you have financial problems. So now you have all of these things going. So that's something you really have to look out for each other. That doesn't mean everybody that is retired and going through a divorce and financial problems is suicidal, but it's worth having a conversation, especially if they start drinking. I'm going to show later the statistics of alcohol combined with these different life events and how you cope with these different life events is a real warning signal for suicide, and you should be talking to each other. So there is another theorist that I like, and he started researching suicide way before Joyner, and he also, interestingly enough, has a 3-component theory. But he talks about suicide, and he came up with different points that 80% of people who take their own life do talk about it beforehand, 80%. Now that doesn't mean that every person that says, man, I wish I wasn't here anymore, that you should be putting them in the hospital. You know, it doesn't mean that, but you should maybe encourage them to get some help or something like that, okay? They experience there's a period of time where they're experiencing strong ambivalence about should I do it or shouldn't I do it? And they're really wrestling with this. And that short time, that ambivalence, that is a window that if they get help, that could, really change the direction and the course. That window of time, if they talk to somebody, is very, very important because that's when they're trying to make up their mind. They see it as a solution, going back to the male depression that I talked about and the shame of having emotion. They feel that the end of their life is the only solution to the shame that they're feeling. The shame and humiliation that they may be feeling for something. Or guilt. It's as if they have a tunnel vision at that time. They don't ever see a time before that they were happy, or they can't see a time in the future where they'll be happy. At this time, when they're in a suicidal mindset, they have very much a tunnel vision. They feel isolated and disengaged from family and friends. They really put on a show sometimes that they're fine. Remember, because the way they grew up, the way males grow up, they show this, that everything's fine, they're still goal-oriented. I heard of some case where someone, I think in Florida, took their own life, a firefighter, and like the day before he helped somebody move, it was like business as usual, and then he took his life the next day, The pain is hidden from everybody because, again, feelings are shameful. So first responders tend to cope in unhealthy ways. They avoid the pain, but they distract by drinking alcohol, and they hide the pain from others. They don't want other people to know that they're suffering because that's shameful. So therapy obviously can help during this time, right? To talk, to try to hit that window, that ambivalent window, and maybe it could make a difference. So they did a study on people who attempted suicide but did not complete. They were not successful. And then afterwards they asked them, what was going through your mind? Why did you do this? And they stated that loneliness was the #1 reason. That they felt no one could really understand what they were feeling and going through. So that's that lonely feeling. And the fact of the matter is, just everyone being a human being, people do understand feelings that everyone has, right? They're universal feelings of sadness, and we've all felt sadness, right? We have all felt shame, we've all felt guilt, we've all felt these common human feelings. So if that person was able to talk to someone, they wouldn't feel as lonely. That's why peer support really is a helpful thing. There is an organization out there, Illinois Firefighter Peer Support Team, that you can call at any time. Anyone can call and find a firefighter to talk to that knows what you're going through. And they're trained peer supporters. So then he talks about this 3 components, okay? He states that this downward spiral usually begins with a major stress or trauma. And that's different for everybody, right? Stress or trauma. It could be a divorce. I find a lot of times a breakup of a relationship, I really pay attention to that. That could be a very important stress or trauma. It could be a trauma on the job. It could be, there's actually statistics out there that a lot of people take their own life after their parents die. It doesn't matter how old you are. You could be 50 years old, but there's a high percentage of suicides when someone's parent dies. It can trigger a lot of feelings from childhood. So, a sensitive temperament. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of empathy. These people tend to have a lot of empathy for people, and those people are at risk. And they have this internal narrator, again, that actually is very harsh and hates that emotional side into themselves. So they feel a lot of shame, and they're very angry at any emotion that they have. And they want it to go away, so much so that they will take their own life. So there's theories for everything, and you can take them or leave it. And what I do when I go to conferences like this, I take all the stuff that makes sense to me and I discard the rest. So with addictions, what this theorist that really makes sense to me is a man named Gabor Mate, and he's a lot different than what's out there through the medical association. He states that he does not medicalize addiction. He is saying the opposite of what the American Society of Addiction Medicine asserts in defining addiction as a primary brain disorder. So he does not believe that you have this alcoholic brain and your parents were alcoholics, so you're destined to be an alcoholic because you have that alcoholic gene. He does not believe that. He states that in his view, an addiction is an attempt to solve a life problem, usually one involving emotional pain or stress. It arises out of an unresolved life problem that the individual has no positive solution for, and only secondarily does it act like a primary brain disorder. So that's different, right? That's different than what the American Medical Association states, and I really like his theory. So he describes addiction as a relationship. The issue with the addiction is not the external activity, but the internal relationship to it. One person's passion is another person's addiction. And he talks about, so it's not the substance, it's not the thing. It's what you are trying to run away from or distract yourself from, or what you're getting out of it. For example, I'll take gambling. Some people have gambling problems. They can't leave the boat, they can't leave. I can't wait to get out of there. You know, so it's really not gambling that's the problem, it's the person's relationship to it, right? And he has a very interesting addiction that I know that all of you are gonna be like, this is so far out there, because I know that I feel that way. But that it's just the point, and just to prove that you can be addicted to anything. And his belief is, again, it's not the thing, it's what you're trying to seek from it, what you're trying to accomplish. He has an addiction to classical music. Weird, huh? He spends enormous amounts of money buying rare pieces of Mozart and different composers, and he has a whole room filled with classical music, more than he would ever be able to listen to, and he has spent, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars on classical music that he doesn't have time to listen to. That's a problem. He states that as a big problem in his life, and he admits it. He openly talks about this in his presentations. So you see, it's really not classical music. I mean, we could care less about, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I could care less about buying classical music. I would not spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on buying classical music. But that just goes to show you, it's what he describes getting online and the hunt. When he's online and he finds the piece, he gets that whole dopamine and this whole adrenaline going. And he feels this euphoria because he found this very, very rare piece of music. and he is addicted to that. And that is like the person who is trying to maybe forget about a bad call, and so they drink, or they're trying to sleep, and so they take a drink. They're trying to forget that their marriage is falling apart, so they drink. So that is that same sort of relationship. It's just basically what kind of coping skills are you using to help you get through. What I like about the Boromate is he's not very judgmental. He states that at that time, that person did the best job they could to survive to get through. And it works for a long time. Again, I told you why it doesn't work anymore, because your body starts shutting down, making its own chemicals. But it works for a very long, long time. To drink, to feel better, to forget, to take the edge off, to lower your anxiety. It works for a very long time. And so it's really unfair what I find in the fire service. I mean, substance abuse problems are a big problem in the fire service. And it's encouraged, and you can't go anywhere or do anything with any firefighter unless you're drinking. You can't talk to a firefighter, you can't go to any function with a firefighter unless you're doing a lot of drinking. And it's encouraged. But then, when somebody has a problem, they're like the plague, you know? They get into trouble, then then they're judged. I've seen this happen where people go into inpatient units, and then all of a sudden, they're kind of ostracized. And see how unfair that is? That is terribly unfair. It's encouraged. Everyone encourages it, and then when someone eventually, and everyone will eventually have a problem if you continue drinking like that to solve your life problems, then all of a sudden, no one's there. So it's very, very unfair. I think there is a huge judgment with that. So all addictions have this in common. They have compulsive behaviors, okay? They have a craving. There's a craving for that substance. There is a temporary pleasure or relief, negative consequences. There's a denial that there is a problem. There's shame after you drink when you don't want to. And again, in the brain, when you even think about drinking, there's dopamine. Now you don't even have to drink. You just have to think about it. And that's where this compulsion and this sort of craving happens. And that's when you know you have a problem. Many times in my practice, I'll have someone that will come to see me and they'll say, I don't really think I'm an alcoholic, I'm just going to cut back. And I was like, yeah, okay, let's try that. Many counselors won't see people like I do because I want to be there at all steps. That's my personal belief. But a lot of counselors will say, I'm not even going to see you until you stop drinking because we're not going to get anywhere in therapy. I have a little more patience than that. So I say, let's just try that. Let's see what happens. What is your goal? So they'll probably say, well, I think I'll be fine if I just have 3 drinks and then I can stop. And then I seem to get in a lot of trouble after that 3rd drink. That's when all the problems start beginning. So I think I can just, if I stop at 3, I think it'll be all good. Like, okay, who am I? I'm not God, I don't know. Like, maybe there are people that can cut back and they're fine. They had some life-changing moment, they stop at 3, they're fine. 99% of the time it doesn't happen. So I'll say, yeah, okay, let's try that. You have a plan. But I tell them, if you go over the 3rd drink when everything in you said, I'm not going to go over that 3rd drink, and you still find yourself doing that, that is what a compulsion is. That is when you know you have a problem. And it's possible that you need to be a non-drinker. Alcohol can progress to a point where you can never really drink normally. Again, there's changes in the brain. Changes that happen in the brain. And of course, I'm very patient and I let people figure this out for themselves because whatever I say isn't going to make a difference, but feeling free and I think open to talking to me about it every step of the way, I think that that's more important. But I let people try to figure this out for themselves, but I tell them all the time, if you have a number in your head and you go over your own number, that is what a compulsion is, because I want them to come up with this kind of solution themselves. I want them to see that. So the purpose of the addiction It serves a valid purpose. The problem is we don't give men in this society or first responders in this society very many options. We teach our first responders to solve all the problems, be the warrior, be strong, don't show any weakness, save the day, but don't be scared about it and don't be sad, and be our providers, but don't have any anxiety about that. We teach this, but we don't give anyone like any sort of idea of what to do when you do feel scared, when you do feel sad, when you do have all of these emotions. We don't give them very many options. So this is what the substance serves: comfort, distraction from pain, and stress relief. Lowering that anxiety, lowering that on-edge feeling, right? The short fuse syndrome. You have a couple drinks and you don't have such a short fuse. You can deal with your kids better. You can deal with your wife better, right? You have more patience. But in the long run, it could be a lot of problems. In the short run, it works. So though the substance behavior does not effectively meet the needs of a person, it still serves a valid purpose in his life. There's nothing inherently like this person was destined to be an alcoholic and he has an alcoholic brain. It's a way of solving life problems, but it's not the best way. It's not the best way. So this is what I'm talking about. I cannot talk about any of these things, or I don't like to. Let's put it this way. I don't like to talk about alcohol or suicide separately because they all intersect. Depression and mood disorders are the #1 risk factor for suicide. So that covert depression, that's even worse. First responder depression is a secret depression, and if it's a secret, and if it's the #1 reason, risk factor for suicide, that's bad news. Because no one can see it. It's secret. Addiction is the second highest risk factor for suicide, and if in the fire service it is encouraged that you all drink, that's another problem, isn't it? Suicide rate is very high for first responders. The strongest predictor of suicide is alcoholism. 85% of completed suicides have alcohol in their bloodstream. When you drink, you're actually inhibiting this prefrontal cortex, so you're not really thinking long term at that point. You're thinking very impulsively, very short term. Highest suicide risk right after being discharged from the hospital. So when someone goes in an inpatient unit, or believe it or not, for a substance abuse problem, it's crucial when they get out that they feel very supported. Because when they get out, if they relapse and if they go back into an environment, let's say they go back to some family problems at home or problems at work, and then they drink again, they feel a lot of guilt and shame because they just got out of a 30-day, inpatient unit. So that is a kind of a risky time too, because they feel a lot of guilt and shame. Does anyone have any questions so far? Comments? Anything? Nope. So stress and trauma. I'm going to talk a lot about biology here again, because we can't get away from the biology of this. I cannot really talk about trauma and PTSD without talking about what's going on in the body. So there are different definitions of trauma. An event that posed a significant threat to the individual, series of events that are intense, continuous, reoccur, and seem to have no means of escape. I want you to focus on the no means of escape, okay? So that's your job. You can't. So right there, almost every call you go on is going to be a trauma. Why? Because it's your job to stay there. Everyone else is running away from it, but you don't have a means of escape because it's your job to solve it. So an injury, wound, or hurt that caused the individual to have a sense of helplessness, loss, fear afterward, making it impossible to feel safe, confident, balanced, and happy. The key word there is helplessness. Most of the time when you're called, it's already a really bad situation, right? They don't call you when everything's like okay. They're calling you when there's something really bad going on, and many times you're not going to save the day, and you're going to feel helpless. Many times you're going to feel like there was nothing I could do, and that causes a trauma that could potentially turn into PTSD. This is the most important one that I really, really want you, if you don't remember anything at all about this presentation, remember this third one. When the body releases a profound amount of survival hormones and energy and has not had the ability to use that energy for effective action. So the fight or flight response, again, let's think about the tiger is going to come and eat you. Your body gets geared up for survival. You're in survival mode. You have adrenaline, you have cortisol, you have norepinephrine, you have dopamine, you have glucose. Glucose is to run. You have energy, right, to fight and run. Dopamine is in case you get bit. That's like a pain reducer, right? If you get hurt, you're not going to feel the pain because of dopamine. Cortisol and adrenaline gets you amped up to have that energy. That's what I call the fight or flight cocktail. So your body at that point was made to run or fight. When you're running or fighting, you are moving your body and you are breathing really heavy, right? So when you go on a call, and let's say it's just an alarm, you're getting like amped up, and you go and you sit down again, right? You go back into the engine, you go back into the ambulance, you go back, go sit in the recliner, turn on the TV. You're never getting the chemicals that are supposed to come out of your body to keep you healthy. The chemicals were supposed to be used up through running and fighting. And so the longer the chemicals stay in your body, especially cortisol, cortisol is basically the root of all disease. It's the root of inflammation. Inflammation in your body can cause heart problems, cancer. It also inflames your brain, which can cause anxiety and depression. So what I'm going to tell you right now in a nutshell is exercise, movement, and deep breathing are your friend. Because you're mimicking that fight or that flight, right? You're mimicking that. So you're getting the chemicals out, the cortisol that causes so much damage in your body, and you're getting it out. Does that make sense to everybody? And then the fourth one, a perpetual sense of terror, despair, hopelessness, and disconnection after an event or injury. What I want you to remember there is disconnection. That feeling like you're watching a movie and you're not really there, you're staring off into space and you're not paying attention to what's going on in the room. You feel like a robot. That's disconnection, and that is kind of a warning sign that you're kind of on the road to some like PTSD signs and symptoms. So that disconnected feeling like you're not really part of what's going on, like you're at a family party and you're just kind of not there, you're just kind of like a robot, that is, you know, not a good sign. You might want to talk to someone about that because that is a sign or a symptom of PTSD. So firefighters' most traumatic incidents, I'm going to just let you read this. I'm going to highlight a few.